As churches and civil society, we hope today's debate will contribute to advancing and mainstreaming the thinking of odious debts, so that its recognition will grow and will be considered in political decision-making. It's a pleasure for the organizers, the Evangelical Church of Westphalia, my name is Ulrich Möller, and the United Church of Christ, represented by Dr. Wally Ryan Kuroiba, who will conclude our meeting, to welcome on this panel Professor Reinisch, University of Vienna, an expert in international law, Dörte Dumland of the World Bank's Economic Policy and Debt Department, Maurizio Ragazzi, the bank's legal advisor, Rüdiger von Kleist, the German alternate executive director of the World Bank, Dr. Edith Russell, an economist of the Justice and Witness Ministries of the United Church of Christ, Neil Watkins, the director of Jubilee USA.
Some of you may ask, what is a bishop's concern in a legal and political debate, such as the ones about odious debt? It is a moral dimension, the ethical question, energizing the odious debts doctrine, basically the question of justice, that motivates ecumenical churches to lend their support to finding legal and political solutions. Mind you, in this world of dividing disparities, churches have the love of Jesus Christ in common, and the global networks are second to none in the dispassionate discussion of North-South relational perspectives. As churches, together we raise our voices when national budgets of low and middle income debtor countries are under pressure to servicing debts, particularly when they are not sustainable or when they have been incurred under irresponsible and reckless circumstances, and to their detriment and disadvantage.
Qualified as odious, and this is the origin of the term. In more recent debate, we usually refer to it as illegitimate, but because it has become so current in the international law debate, I will use both terms for this presentation in a synonymous fashion. Now the conclusion may be that such debt incurred by despotic regimes will remain only regime debts, so it will only that regime, and it will not be the state that purportedly is represented by the regime, which will incur liability. And it's exactly that thought that has a major consequence. If there is a change in the legal regime, the debt will automatically lapse. It will not be carried over to the successor government, successor state, whatever. Here we have another excerpt from Alexander Sachs' work of the 1920s. Maybe also, and I think this is a very important aspect that should be kept in mind, emphasizing the idea of the benefit to the country. His idea was that such odious debts would not be carried over to successor governments except where there are real advantages for the people, for the population of the state represented by a government entering into these debts. Now, so far to the historical background of the doctrine, so far to the origin of what we are talking about. There has been a very lively debate about the value and validity under public international law currently involved in the odious debts doctrine, and certainly there have been challenges to it. and show how some of the general principles corroborate, strengthen the argument that the odious debts doctrine can be founded on general principles. The absence of consent. Consent is one of the crucial aspects of any kind of contractual or treaty law relationship. The Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties clearly shows that if there was not true consent, if the consent was somehow invalidated because there was corruption, fraud, whatever you have, then the treaty may be invalidated. Consent, of course, is expressed by a regime, by a government, and if we take a broader look, not just on the formal consent by the government, but also by those represented by the government, I think that notions of good faith will show that the regime, the government, also has to express the true will of the people in order to lead to a valid obligation of such a state.
We also know that debt service is impoverishing many countries around the world. There's over 50 who spend more on their debt payments than spend on either public health or education. We know that these debt repayments are interfering with countries meeting the Millennium Development Goals, and I just want to remind us that when those goals were adopted, it was understood that it was going to mean the countries would need more aid and also would need debt relief in order for the goals to be met. And so it's time, I think, for the industrial nations, the lending nations, to step up to the table and increase the aid and also do additional debt cancellations. Clearly, some of these loans just need to be flatly written off. They cannot be collected. And the other point that we need to remember is often when the debts are renegotiated, this is done with all kinds of conditionalities based on neoliberal principles such as privatization, trade liberalization, reductions in government spending, tactics that have proven time and time again to not be in the interests of third world countries' economic development. These are failed policies and should be not imposed as conditional requirements for countries to qualify for debt cancellation. And finally, accountability and transparency is much on people's tongues these days in terms of the borrowers, but we must also remember that those two criteria, transparency and accountability, must be held up.